With 100 gig, 25 gig, even multiple 10 gig options, this is an amazing switch, but there's a whole lot more because we also get up to 22 SSDs, 20 of them being NVMe, a 16-core ARM processor, and that makes this perhaps the best Switch NAS server ever made. We have so much to get into, so let's get to it. Hey guys, this is Patrick from STH, and this is the new MirkoTik ROSE. Yes, it is green. The actual model number is the MikroTik RDS2216-2XG-4S+4XS-2XQ. Oh my gosh. And the idea behind this is really awesome because MikroTik has decided, hey, what a lot of small businesses need is not just a network switch, they also need a server, but not necessarily, running everything on that server. Instead, what they often need is storage to run things like video cameras or just local file storage, create a share or something like that. And so the idea behind what we're gonna call this the MirkoTik ROSE, because it's the only one right now, is that it's essentially a Switch NAS server or Switch NAS server for a small, medium business. And by the way, since we have like a 2,500 square foot studio, I totally get that in a space like this, if you want high-speed networking and you need storage, that this could be an absolutely awesome option. And by the way, before we get too far in this, the list price for this is under $2,000, and often MikroTik products go for much less than their MSRP. For a lot of small businesses, a lot of folks that are looking at this versus a QNAP or Synology, I think that this is gonna offer a ton of value. And we'll show you this in a bit, but it doesn't actually use that much power, making the ongoing cost not that much. Now, there is one thing that we found that I think a lot of folks have just missed on this because they don't know to test for it, but we found something that is absolutely going to light up the comments. Now, let's be clear, this is an absolutely awesome box. There are some things that I wish they fixed in a future version, but first, I think let's get to the hardware. Okay, this system from front to back is absolutely wild, but the first thing I want to start with is something really great, which is the two power supplies. Now these are both 550 watt power supplies. We're going to talk a little bit more about power consumption in our later section, but I wanted to just say that these are very high quality. These are Delta power supplies. These aren't some kind of like little tiny brand. I'm really stoked that MikroTik is actually using high quality power supplies here. But the back of this is absolutely awesome because we have so many different types of networking. Let me give you some examples. So next to our power supplies, we have our 10 gigabit Ethernet ports. Now these 10 gigabit Ethernet ports are nice because they also support multi-gigabit speeds. Like for example, if you want 2.5 gigabit per second networking, you can do that here as well. Now next to that, we have 4 SFP28 ports. Now these 4 SFP28 ports give us a total of 100 gigabits per second of networking, but also allows us to connect all those 25 gig Ethernet devices without needing a different switch from our 10G base T switch. But what would be better than having 25 gig ports? Maybe 100 gig ports. That's exactly what we have here with our 2 SFP28 ports. Now, of course, at this point, you're like, hey, we got 10G base T, 25 gig Ethernet, SFP28, QSFP28 for 100 gig. What could be cooler than that? Well, what about if I told you that this also had 4 SFP plus ports? So these 4 SFP plus ports give us that 10 gig networking. So if you want to do optical networking, you can. And if you also want to have DACs, sure, you can do that. But if you have 10G base T, that's just on the other side. And of course, there's always 10G base T to SFP plus adapters if you really need to go that route. And that port diversity is absolutely wild on a server. Usually you get like a 1 gig port and maybe a couple 10 gig ports, maybe some 25 gig ports, but very rarely do you get all of this type of networking on the back. Now, of course, all of that is not necessarily directly available to the storage server and all that. We'll show you that in a sec. But I also think that this is great for just a network switch. The other thing you get, of course, in a MikroTik version is you get the console port as well as the management port. Now, these two ports give you access to out-of-band management and also the serial console if you need those. Next to that, you have a USB port, which you could use for a number of different things in the MikroTik ecosystem. We'll let you look that up. And then let's just get wild here, okay? These two ports over here are SFF 8644 ports, and you commonly see these, by the way, on like SAS controllers, but in this case, they're not being used for SAS. Instead, they are external PCIe connectivity. So both of these ports offer PCIe Gen 3 by 4 links, so another 8 links of PCIe. Now, that is absolutely crazy in itself, but you do have external PCIe, so I don't really know what you would use it for right now, but hopefully there's gonna be something really cool you can. For example, you could use 2 of these and go to like another PCIe switch, or I don't know what else, but Just kind of cool that this has it, right? Now, flipping around this unit, you're gonna see the other feature that makes this absolutely crazy. We have a total of 20 U.2 NVMe bays. Now, that is kind of crazy itself because we've seen a number of folks do like SATA and stuff like that, but these aren't just your normal U.2 slots. So let me just kind of pull this out for a second. I'll show you kind of what's going on here. So these are cool because the trays that MikroTik has are actually toolless trays. You'll see that we don't even have the screws installed because they're little nubs and you just pop these drives in, super easy. And Sam, by the way, who's operating the camera, was very happy at the fact that he didn't have to go do 80 screws. But if you think that this thing takes 20 super fast PCIe Gen 5 SSDs, or things like, this EDSFF SSD, because this is pretty thin, you might say this Kioxia drive is not like the perfect fit for this. Well, it's kind of not exactly that. And let me explain why. We actually went out and purchased 20 of these Samsung PM983 SSDs. So each of these drives is only PCIe Gen 3 by 2 for its connectivity. So that means that practically you're limited in your performance of each drive. But really, I think this is more of an exercise in having 20 drives just for the capacity rather than 20 drives for the highest performance you can. Now, there is something else that is pretty important here, which is that these take like 7mm NVMe SSDs. Most of the U.2 drives that you're going to encounter are 15mm drives. So this is what a 15mm drive looks like, and this one right here is your 7mm drive. And the fact that these are only 7mm, I think is a big miss on the system. And let me explain why just real quick. So the nice thing about 7mm drives is that they tend to be lower power, but the other nice thing is that they tend to be inexpensive because like these drives that we bought are super old at this point. They're from 2019. The U.2 15mm drive has become super popular because it allows just more space to have even more than one PCB in there, and you can have NAND on all those PCBs. It just gives you more capacity to go put more components because you have more space, right? That's really the idea. But on the other hand, I kind of get what this is, right? Even if you only have 1 terabyte drives, if you have 20 of them, now you have a 20 terabyte storage server, which is plenty for a lot of businesses. Move up to 2 terabytes or say 4 terabyte drives. At 4 terabytes, you have an 80 terabyte system that also has a ton of networking. Is it a switch? Is it a server? I don't know. Is it a Switch NAS server? Maybe. And so that, to me, at 80 terabytes is a pretty cool feature. Okay, so let's get inside this thing and see how it works. Now, the first thing, of course, you have to take off this giant green cover. And when you take off the green cover, by the way, it's just a bunch of screws. So to me, that's kind of a bummer. I wish that it was a little bit easier to get inside this. But let's start with the mundane. And first up here, we have our areas for our 2 redundant power supplies. Plus we have our power distribution board that's right here. Now this power distribution board feeds both our NVMe backplane as well as our main switchboard. The next feature, it's not really a feature, but it is just a little bit fun. And that's, you can see this giant wall of 10 fans right here, but one of them has to be offset just a little bit because we have the power connector that goes into the NVMe backplane. Now all those fans have standard 4-pin power connectors and they go right into the main switch PCB or NAS server PCB. I don't know what that's called. But whatever it goes into, it does connect just through a standard connector, which is always nice if you have to go replace these later. Now, let's get to the storage that's on the front here, because there's a little feature here that makes this entire thing work, and it makes a lot more sense how it works, right? And that is over here. Now, what you'll see is that we actually have a PCIe switch. That PCIe switch bifurcates a by 16 link from the Annapurna Labs CPU that we'll show you in a sec, all the way out into being able to handle 20 drives with by 2 connections each. So you obviously, even with by 2 connections, 20 drives by 2 gives you 40 PCIe lanes, which is too much for the vast majority of processors, especially in this like kind of low power segment. So we only have PCIe Gen 3 by 16 back to the CPU. And that means that we have a PCIe switch to break out those 16 lanes to the 20 drives. And the reason that this is a super important concept is because that means that the maximum throughput that you could ever get out of all of these 20 SSDs is really like the maximum throughput of like 4 PCIe Gen 3 by 4 SSDs. Now that PCIe Gen 3 by 16 link is kind of interesting in itself because the way that it actually gets from the backplane or that switch chip backplane all the way to the board is there's a little tiny board down here. You can see that we have these little high density press fit connectors, whatever down here. There's a little access port on the side that allows you to open it up and get to that and service it if you want. But a lot of folks these days would just use a cable between these two because that's 2 MCIO by 8 cables or whatever. But instead here, there's like a custom PCB that's made, and it's just kind of a neat little engineering thing. Now looking at our Switch NAS Server board, what you'll see is that there are 2 big heat sinks here. If I were to tell you that on board there's a 16-core ARM processor as well as a 100 gig capable switch, and I asked you which heatsink is which, you'd probably say that this is the switch heatsink and this one is the ARM heatsink, but it's actually reversed. This under here, this is our Marvell switch chip, and this one under here is our Annapurna Labs CPU. Now this is a 16-core, 16-thread CPU. Okay, so looking around the Annapurna Labs, once we got the heatsink off, you'll see that we have a total of 5 chips, or 2 sets of 5 chips, which usually indicates that we have an ECC configuration, because 4 and 8 would be the non-ECC versions. If you see blocks of 5, that usually means that you have ECC, because the extra one is there for parity. Now, the cool thing about this is that we get 32 gigabytes of memory. The not cool thing about this is that that memory is fixed, so we can't go and add another, 64 gigs, 128 gigs, any of that kind of stuff. To me, the number one feature that folks are gonna get this and say they wish they had was higher memory capacity, and so I just kind of feel like that was a big miss on the MikroTik part. Now, above that, we have our switch chip. Now, this is one that MikroTik has used in a number of other switches previously, so it's a pretty known quantity, but that's what gives us the ability to have 100 gig, 25 gig, and all these other types of configurations. Now, another thing that's just kind of fun is when we often talk about SFP+, which are these cages down here, versus 10G base T, which are in the front right here, we need a PHY for the 10G base T or multi-gig ports, and so that's what's under this heatsink right here. So you can see that our 100 gig ports, we just need little heat sinks on them. We have our 25 gig cages, and those, just our cages. Our 10 gig cages are down here. But when we get to the 10G base T, you do need to have a PHY. And that PHY means that you have an extra heatsink. But on this board, there's a pair of features that might make opening all of those screws and just looking inside even more worth it. And that is along the bottom here. We have 2 M.2 slots, but these are SATA slots. So not necessarily as fast as our NVMe slots, but on the other hand, if you just want to add a little bit more storage, you have 2 more drives. Technically, this can take 22 drives internally, which is absolutely awesome, right? Now, at this point, you're probably at least a little bit skeptical. I mean, how in the heck did MikroTik make this all work? That's what we have right here, and something I love is that MikroTik actually publishes their block diagrams. Now, up here, you're gonna see that we have our Marvell 98DX4310, which is a switch chip that has 16 ports. Now, those 16 ports are allocated in a pretty neat way. We have 2 of the ports going to the 100 gig ports that are on the outside, so those QSFP28 ports. We have another 4 ports that are the SFP28 ports, 25 gig. Then we have our 10 gig SFP plus ports, of which we have 4 of those, and then we have 2 10G base T ports. Now at this point, you'd be right if you said, hey, Patrick, you only have 12 ports there, but you have a 16 port switch. What the heck is going on? That's where some of the magic happens, because we have 4 ports that are going to the Annapurna Labs CPU section. And so what that means is that we have 4 25 gig connections, or 100 gigabits total, going between our switch chip and our Annapurna Labs chip. Now why that matters is that that's about 100 gigabits per second, or about the same as a PCIe Gen 3 by 16 link between the two. And so that's exactly why I say that this is really a network switch plus a NAS, because the connection between the management or the main processor and the switch chip is really a 4 by 25 or 100 gig link between the two, right? So it's not like these are on the same PCIe Express or anything like that. They're using networking essentially. Okay, now here you can see that the Annapurna Labs chip has a number of those other features that we saw on the front panel. Like for example, we have the USB 3 port. We also have our 2 SFF8644 ports. Both of those, of course, are 4 lanes of PCIe Gen 3, which you can see coming off there. Then we have our 1 gigabit management port. We have our 2 M.2 SATA ports, not NVMe again. Then we have our DRAM hanging off of here, as well as our NAND. Now you're gonna see this and you're gonna wonder what the heck this 128 megabytes thing is. That's just there to really run Router OS. It's not there to go and run a ton of apps. Again, that's one where I kind of feel like if MikroTik wants to move really into that server space, having that M.2 storage be available, or having more NAND on board just to have more storage, I think would be a really good thing. And then down here, you're gonna see that we have our PCIe Gen 3 by 16 link, which then goes down to our PCIe switch, and then to all of our SSDs. Now the processor itself is an Annapurna Labs AL73400, which is a 2 gigahertz, 16-core, 16-thread ARM processor. Now, ARM processors are not necessarily the slowest by any means, but on the other hand, do not expect this to compete with like a high-end Xeon or EPYC or anything like that. This is really a lower-end processor. Only 2 gigahertz is not crazy fast if we're being honest, but on the other hand, it does give you enough power that if you want to run something that uses low power, like for example, if you want to run a DNS server on here, if you want to go run your NAS or something on here, you have enough CPU power to do that. Of course, at this point, you're probably wondering, like, how the heck does this all work from a software perspective? So let's get to that next. Okay, so what I want to talk about next is really the software, because this is something that I think MikroTik needs to do better on in terms of supporting a Switch NAS server. For a switch or a router, I get it, but on the other hand, you're going to see all of the normal stuff that you would see with the MikroTik switch. But if you want to use it for storage, well, that's a little bit more challenging. Now, if you just want to see the disks in the system, it's pretty easy. You go to System and then Disks, and then once you're there, you're going to see all the disks. We have a full 22 drives that are connected to this, but there are some weird things. Like, for example, you can see that there's a PCIe bridge, which I think is a PCIe switch that you can see is, a 16-lane, PCIe Gen 3 switch. But on the other hand, you can do things like there's an option to eject it, which that's just kind of weird. And when you click into the NVMe SSDs, things get a little bit interesting because there's tons of different options. But if you think about all of the things that you want to do, maybe I see, formatting and stuff like that, that makes sense. But like, what happens if I just want to make a RAID array and then I want to go and share it as a NFS share, or SMB share, or something like that? It's really hard to figure out what the heck any of this stuff means. And frankly, I think that there needs to be more in-context menus. Now, if you do want to go and create a storage array like you would with a QNAP or a Synology, a TrueNAS box, any of that kind of stuff, well, then your option is actually, I think you go into the CLI. I didn't believe this, so we went to the documentation, and yeah, the answer seems to be that you actually are going to manage your storage via the CLI. If you want to do a RAID array, they have a portion for that. If you want to go do a NVMe over Fabric, so you want to just go and export an NVMe drive over the network, you can do that as well, but it's, it is kind of what it is, right? This is a command line thing where you're going through the documentation and saying like, this is how I want to go and build my storage array. And then like once all that stuff is created, you don't really have a easy way to go and manage it. To me, it just feels like MikroTik needs a web management interface. I mean, they have so many management interfaces that are awesome, especially for SMB segments that would probably use this type of device. So I just kind of feel like this is an area where they definitely need it, and you can clearly see it here. And just a real quick note on the storage performance, just because you have a PCIe Gen 3x4 drive, because it's limited to a x2 link, your maximum throughput from that drive is only going to be, a little over 10 gigabits per second. Now, of course, on the Switch side, the Marvell chip is able to go and run, the ports at line rate. So that's kind of what you want. But when you get over to the NAS side, you still have a 16-core Annapurna Labs processor. That's a very good processor for a storage applications. Plenty, frankly, for what you need these days for storage, especially if you're talking about a maximum of 100 gig link. Okay, and then there's one other thing I want to talk about, which is really the server part of this. Now, because you have the Router OS, or you have the special ROSE edition of the Router OS, you do have the ability to run some applications. And really, I think the way that MikroTik is thinking about deploying applications on their hardware is really using containers and Docker images. It's weird because you go and you search for Docker, not there. You search for container, you don't get any results. But of course, if you were to go and search for other things, you would see those options easily in the interface. So just to me, it feels like MikroTik needs to come up with a web interface for the storage as well as the containers. But on both fronts, what I really hope is that the MikroTik folks watching this look at something like a QNAP, because what QNAP does really well is they have a lot of in-context menus. So as you're going through the storage interface, either a storage interface or even looking at running containers or VMs or something like that on their platform, they have a really good interface that says in the interface it says, here's what this option does, or here's why you might want to use this or enable or disable this function, or what is the difference between RAID 6 and RAID 5 and all that kind of stuff. And so to me, at least, that is something that's really important in a market where you have SMB customers. Asking somebody that is trying to buy an inexpensive box that's an SMB customer, but then you're saying if you go buy a QNAP or Synology, you're getting this great management interface that tells you all of the things that you need to know when you're setting stuff up. And then
you take the MikroTik version and it's like, oh, actually now you have to know what all of these things on the CLI mean. It just, to me, that's just a bridge too far for a lot of folks. So for a power user, I think this makes sense, and just hopefully this is something they can do in future software updates. Let's keep going.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the power consumption for a second, but also how this all looks, right? So we have this set up right now with 20 NVMe SSDs. So you're gonna see that right back here that we have our 21 terabyte NVMe SSDs. All of those, of course, NVMe SSDs use power. So this is not the lowest power configuration, but you know, frankly, if you're buying this to not be just a switch, you're really buying it because you want those server features, you want those NAS features. So we're just showing you what 20 Samsung drives look like in this, right? And with that, we get about 135 watts at idle for power consumption, more than a switch, but of course, not too bad because we have 20 drives here. Frankly, I thought this thing was gonna be crazy loud, but instead it's right in the 47 to 49 dBA range. So you're probably hearing it on the microphone I have on me, but on the other hand, it's not crazy loud. I mean, this is something that you could definitely stick in an equipment closet and use no problem. Frankly, these days in a data center, this would be one of the quietest things that you have. Just real quick, I was wondering what would happen if we pulled out and put in a drive. And what happens on a lot of servers, frankly, if they're not well thought out, you would see that this server will actually go and reset. But I think because we have the PCIe switch there, that's helping a bit. But we did get kicked out, so let's see. Oh yeah, it did reset, so I guess these aren't hot swappable. That's really interesting, didn't know that. Yep, it's restarting. Okay, so what we just learned was that if you pull a drive out, it seems like that is sometimes kicking us out of the management interface and getting that part to reset. So might not be actually hot pluggable. Okay, yeah, so I just hit refresh and see as I pulled that drive out, we lost connection. So this happened again where we pulled out a drive and that is taking down the NAS. So kind of interesting here, we have the drive out, the system is actually, it looks like it rebooted. And then right here, you're gonna see that we have the drive that is not installed anymore. It does appear that this is definitely not a hot swap design. Okay, now we've taken all of the drives out of the system. They're just pulled out. Of course, the system has reset. But what we see over here is that our power consumption is down dramatically. Now, in terms of noise, we're at that same 47 to 49 dBA that we were before. But now on our power consumption, we're down under like 74 watts or something like that. So we've gone from about 135 watts down to, call it 74, 75 watts. And really that difference of 60 watts is because we have those 20 NVMe SSDs running. We could have that 135 watts, but we would expect additional power consumption from all of the optics and stuff that you can plug in over here. Plus we can also run that CPU at a higher power consumption level. So the official specs for this is that MikroTik says that we can get 105 watts without attachments. Of course, that'd be no drives, no pluggable optics, any of that kind of stuff. But this could go all the way up to 286 watts. We never got this high. We never do, frankly, on MikroTik products, but apparently you can get that high if you tried.
Now, for all of these videos, I like to have a key lessons learned section, like what do we learn by this? And of course, for this one, we have a lot going on. First off, let's just talk about what MikroTik is trying to do. I think this is an awesome package, right? Including things like your NAS for storage. Also from a power perspective, this is not necessarily the highest power device. A lot of it, of course, if you add that storage, you're gonna be paying for it in disk power consumption. But other than that, I mean, this is actually a fairly low cost and also compact solution. But of course, this is also a first-gen product, so I think there are some things that I would like to personally see changed. The first one, of course, is socketed memory, right? We should have SODIMM slots or socketed slots. I know it costs more, but on the other hand, it just, to me, feels like folks are going to want to upgrade the memory. I sure as heck want more memory in this. I'd love to either put 64 gigs, 128 gigs, or heck, more if that's possible. But to me, the big one is really like, we're losing the management interface and we're seeing a reset when we're doing that hot plug function, right? Now, let's talk about why. I think a lot of folks that have been doing data storage for a while have seen this, but if you have a virtualization server and you have a storage array that all of a sudden decides to reset itself, that can be really bad, lead to things like VM corruption and all that kind of stuff that you don't really want. Now, the origin of why this is a challenge and we actually have to test for it on new platforms is because, well, frankly, the NVMe spec was done at a time, right, when AMD was pretty much out of the server market. Intel Xeon E5 was like the thing. You know, everything was validated on Intel Xeon, right? Because there's no other real server option in the market. And so when AMD EPYC 7001 Naples launched in 2017, we saw this and we covered it. The fact that you could literally, if you took a drive out, plug the drive in, you would find that the system would have to go and reboot. And of course, when you have a lot more memory because you have a server, that takes a long time and it's a total pain. Now on AMD EPYC platforms, this works, but there are new ARM platforms that we've covered in things like our Substack, where, like, let's just give you an example. If you look at an NVIDIA Grace platform, you will notice that the Bluefield 3 GPU is usually handling the NVMe SSDs, and there are a couple of reasons for it. You can now guess what one of those is. And that's also pretty common on ARM architectures in general if folks haven't done this validation. Now, what some folks can do is actually get PCIe switches and some of the switch firmware to handle that handoff, and that sometimes works for folks. So it might be the case where MikroTik is able to go and release new PCIe switch firmware that fixes this, but I don't know. Now, let's talk about why this also matters just from a broader context. Like, how often are you gonna have to do this? So if you look at a hard drive, you're talking like a 5% AFR rate. When you instead get to SSDs, you're talking well under 0.5%. A lot of times people tell us like 0.2, 0.3% failure rate. And so on 20 drives, it's not necessarily like this is gonna happen all the time. It's just something to keep in mind that, you know, when you have 20 drives, that also means you have 20 different components that can fail. You also have all the backplane and all that kind of stuff from a reliability standpoint. So that's why, you know, it's one of the reasons that I think that having 15mm drives would be way better. In fact, I would probably prefer to have 8 15mm drives or 4 15mm drives than having 27mm drives because, well, frankly, getting the 7mm drives is just harder these days, and 15mm drives means that, you know, even if you had 4 drive bays, technically, if you wanted to spend a ton of money on this solution, you could go and put, you know, 0.5 petabyte into a server like this. And if you have 8 drives, you can now put a petabyte into an 8 drive 15mm U.2 solution, right? So just to me, it would make it a lot more, number one, reliable because you have fewer points of failure, but also it would make it, you know, just more useful being able to expand your storage. But on the other hand, if you go and buy used, I think we bought all of the, you know, 20 drives for something like $600-700. We also bought another, you know, 2 just SATA drives new, and I think that was like $80-90. So overall, I mean, you can get a decent amount of storage, especially for most businesses, without spending a ton. But overall, if you look at this compared to the Switch NAS servers that we looked at from folks like QNAP way back in the day, I think that this is such a better design. I just love what MikroTik is doing here. And as a first generation product, it's actually really good. I hope they take my feedback in this and they make some revs in the future generations, but this could be a super cool line for MikroTik and a great way for them to expand. Now, of course, I know we're gonna have a lot of comments on this and I'd love to hear what you guys think. So if you do have some thoughts, well, go drop them down in the comments. But also, if you like this video, well, why don't you share it with your friends and colleagues? Also, give it a like, click subscribe, and turn on those notifications so you can see whenever we come out with great new videos. As always, thanks for watching. Have an awesome day.